The United States didn't announce a warning. It didn't issue a countdown. Instead, it quietly tracked a massive oil tanker across the Atlantic and then took control of it. This wasn't just about one ship, and it wasn't just about oil. According to publicly available information, this single move connects Venezuela, Russia, the Caribbean, the Arctic, and even renewed conversations about Greenland, all in the same geopolitical moment. And once you see how these pieces line up, the timing starts to matter a lot more than the headline suggests. That immediately raised a key question for analysts watching closely: why now? According to experts familiar with shipping data, one of the seized vessels, identified as the M. Sophia, was carrying an unusually large and specific cargo. Roughly 2 million barrels of crude oil, loaded from Venezuela's Jose oil terminal in the final days of December, based on satellite imagery and port reports. This wasn't a partial shipment, it wasn't experimental, it was a full commercial-scale load. And it wasn't the first time. Publicly available tracking data shows that the same tanker had previously completed a nearly identical voyage months earlier, loading a similar amount of Venezuelan crude before heading toward offshore Malaysia. That earlier cargo, according to analysts, was likely transferred at sea to another vessel, a method sometimes used to obscure final destinations. What matters here is not speculation, but pattern. When the same ship carrying the same volume from the same port follows the same route more than once, that number is not symbolic, it's structural. At that scale, oil isn't just energy, it's leverage. According to officials, lawmakers in both the House and Senate were scheduled to receive classified briefings on the broader Venezuela-related operation. That alone suggests the issue goes beyond maritime enforcement and into national security considerations. Even members of Congress who said they only knew what had been reported publicly expressed support for the seizure. Senator Jean Shaheen, the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said she was not opposed to the move, citing concerns about what she described as Russia's use of a shadow fleet to move oil below market rates. Her statement is notable not for what it accuses, but for what it accepts as normal, that enforcement actions like this are now part of an ongoing, expected strategy. And the United States was not acting alone. The United Kingdom confirmed that it provided operational support during the interception. According to the British Defence Ministry, UK forces assisted with basing, surveillance, and coordination as the vessel was interdicted in the North Atlantic, in the region between the UK, Iceland, and Greenland. That geographic detail matters. Because while the tanker itself was the immediate focus, the location places the operation inside one of the most strategically sensitive maritime corridors in the world. British officials described the action as part of broader global efforts to enforce sanctions and disrupt evasion networks. The language was formal, measured, and deliberate. But it also hinted at something larger. Because while this operation was unfolding, the White House confirmed that the administration was discussing a range of options regarding Greenland. Not hypothetically, not academically. According to official statements, those discussions included strategic considerations tied to the Arctic region, with the clarification that no options were being ruled out at this stage. Greenland's government responded by requesting a meeting with Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And suddenly, the story isn't just about oil tankers anymore. It's about shipping lanes, Arctic access, energy flows, and the quiet coordination between allies across multiple regions at the same time. And the most important question now isn't what was seized. It's what comes next. What comes next depends on how this moment is interpreted by all sides involved. According to analysts, the coordinated nature of these actions sends a message that goes beyond enforcement. It signals visibility. The routes that once relied on limited oversight are now being actively monitored. And once monitoring becomes consistent, the margin for quiet maneuvering shrinks quickly. This is especially relevant for vessels linked to sanctioned oil movements, where timing, routing, and partnerships are critical. If even one part of that chain becomes predictable, the entire system becomes vulnerable. That may explain why officials emphasize cooperation rather than confrontation. Public statements from both US and UK officials avoided inflammatory language. They focused instead on process, legality, and international coordination. That tone is intentional. It keeps the story framed as enforcement, not escalation. And that distinction matters for what happens next behind closed doors. At the same time, the scale of the oil involved cannot be ignored. 2 million barrels on a single tanker represents weeks of output and millions in market value. When multiplied across repeated voyages, the numbers become significant enough to influence broader energy calculations. This is where Venezuela re-enters the picture more directly. The announcement that tens of millions of barrels could be turned over to the U.S. reframes Venezuela not just as a source of concern, but as a variable in a larger negotiation. That shift changes incentives. It introduces new questions about compliance, oversight, and future transport routes. It also raises the possibility that future shipments may look very different from those of the past: more transparency, more direct channels, more scrutiny. And that feeds back into why lawmakers are receiving classified briefings. This isn't just about what happened at sea. It's about anticipating reactions, adjustments, and second-order effects. When multiple regions are involved simultaneously, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Arctic, it suggests planning rather than reaction. And planning implies that this moment was expected, not accidental. The final piece is perception. How this story is understood by other shipping operators, by energy markets, and by governments watching quietly from the sidelines. Because enforcement actions don't just stop ships, they reshape behavior. And when behavior changes, new patterns emerge. That's where the real consequences begin. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually as routes are reconsidered and risks recalculated. This is why the Greenland discussion matters here. It's not separate, it's adjacent. Access, positioning, and long-term presence in the Arctic intersect directly with energy transport and maritime oversight. And once those conversations are public, even briefly, they influence how future moves are interpreted. The story now sits at a crossroads. One path treats this as an isolated seizure. Another sees it as the opening move in a longer realignment, and the difference between those interpretations will shape what happens next. This isn't the end of the story. It's the point where the comprising pieces become visible. And in the next phase, the most important developments may not happen at sea at all. They may happen quietly in meetings, in agreements, and in decisions that never make headlines. If you want to understand where this is heading, the next step is to follow how these countries adjust their strategies, not their statements, because that's where the real signal always appears. As this situation develops, the most revealing signals won't come from dramatic announcements. They'll come from subtle shifts, from how shipping routes are adjusted, from which ports become quieter and which become more active, from how often allied navies coordinate in regions that used to see less attention. These changes tend to happen gradually, but they rarely happen by accident. When multiple governments act in parallel, it usually reflects shared expectations about what's coming next. That's why this moment matters beyond the immediate headlines. It shows how enforcement, energy policy, and geography are starting to overlap more visibly. And once those lines blur, decisions become harder to reverse. The seizure of these vessels may ultimately be remembered less for what was taken, and more for what it revealed, that certain systems are no longer operating in the shadows. And when visibility increases, strategy replaces improvisation. This brings us to the broader takeaway. Understanding global events today requires looking at timing, coordination, and context, not just isolated actions. One ship alone doesn't change the world, but a pattern does, and patterns are where long-term shifts begin. In the next chapter of this story, the key question won't be about enforcement, it will be about adaptation. How energy producers respond, how transport networks adjust, and how geopolitical priorities quietly realign in response. If you want to follow that evolution, the next video breaks down what these shifts could mean for future shipping routes, energy markets, and strategic regions that are suddenly getting renewed attention. Because this story isn't over, it's just entering its next phase.